Like many people, U.S. President Donald Trump expressed his sadness over the shooting in Parkland, Florida. Here's what he had to say on Twitter. My prayers and condolences to the families of the victims of the terrible Florida shooting. No child, teacher, or anyone else should ever feel unsafe in an American school. We've heard many versions of thoughts and prayers being offered to victims before. Is that enough in this case? Let's talk to our panel about this. And a reminder, we're also streaming this conversation live on the CBC News Facebook page and on YouTube, and we'll be bringing some of your thoughts into the panel, so do get involved in the comments sections. Tonight, we're joined by Paul Kershaw in Vancouver. He's a UBC professor and founder of Generation Squeeze. In Toronto, Michael Corrin is an author and columnist. And in Ottawa, Katie O'Malley is a writer with iPolitics. And I mean, Michael, if we could, I'll start with you. I think I've seen a show of yours where you tried to get into this conversation. What is it about the dealing with this conversation around gun control and around tackling this specific issue, however you want to approach it, that makes it so difficult in the United States?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I've done hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of interviews over the years when I used to host a TV show, and only once, even with my appalling personality, only once has anyone ever walked off, and that was a gun advocate. When I said to him, he'd mentioned people having guns in churches, and I said, is it not slightly jarring that in a place where you worship the Prince of Peace, you have an automatic weapon? And he stormed off. There's very little conversation to be had here because America is a polarized society, and it's wrong if we think of it as being entirely composed of people who are obsessed with guns. It's one of the most literate, educated, and generous societies in history, and that's not hyperbole. But within it, there is a strong minority, I would say a minority, 40, going closer to 50% of people, who are absolutely committed to gun ownership. And they're not just Republican, and they're not just conservative. There are minority groups now, Jewish groups, gay groups, that say we need to own guns for our own protection. It's almost in the DNA. It's partly from the Second Amendment, which is a misinterpretation. That's about the right to assemble a militia, a collective security, not individual gun ownership. But today we have a society where, I mean, even today, after this massacre, and there will be more. I mean, pray God I'm wrong, but there will be more, and there have been many in the past. We had the parents of children who were actually in the school. They weren't killed, thank goodness, but they were in the school in danger of being killed. Parents saying, we still demand the right to own guns. This is an American freedom. It's nothing to do with an American freedom. It's almost, I suppose, a collective psychosis. But I don't think, no, let me restate that. I know it's not going to change. If it didn't change after Sandy Hook, when children, little children, 6 and 7 years old, were massacred, it's not going to change now.
Katie, the conversation has always been heated, and I remember from when I was young, people being heated around this issue as a constitutional issue, and people would get upset about it. Has it become yet more heated in the days of social media? The exchanges I'm seeing on Twitter today are frankly horrific.
I think so. Well, I think we're perhaps more aware of the polarization because the two sides are talking to each other more, and they're doing it on a platform like Twitter or Facebook or in a comment thread, which means that we all get to kind of behold it. In that sense, it's interesting what Michael says, and I think he's absolutely right. It's almost as though the debate has become so entwined with American culture in general that it would be impossible to sort of pry it out and have just a sort of clinical discussion about guns, about gun control, about law enforcement. It just spreads into everything else, and I think that that's what makes it so difficult to really discuss a policy, because it isn't so much about, you know, okay, what could we do, practically speaking, to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, or to protect people in places like schools. It becomes this issue about America as a concept, and I don't think that it's possible to really have a cool, reasonable debate when that's how it's being framed.
And Paul, I'm going to throw a stat at you that always shocks me when I first read it, and frankly every time I look at it on days like today, that the concentration of gun ownership in the United States is not nearly as illustrative as I think a lot of us assume it would be. I think of America as a gun-toting nation, 300 million guns, whatever it is. The Washington Post, using data from Azrael, says 78% of Americans own no guns at all. 19% of Americans own 50% of the guns, and 3% of Americans own the other 50. If that is in fact true, how is it that all of the people that aren't owning guns and are watching this and wondering what on earth is going on haven't stood up and said, come on guys, let's get this fixed?
Well, I think there are two issues at play, and we've touched on one of them to begin with, which is namely that there's a values conflict. On the one hand, you have a value about let's care for our kids and prevent harm at our schools or for our citizens more generally. And in the process of doing that, we run into a different... I'm sorry, I'm just getting a lot of feedback, so I'm really having a hard time chatting right now.
Why don't we try to get that sorted out?
Yeah.
And
Sorry
I'll come back to you. Because I do want to bring in some of the questions. We put up a call for people to comment on this so we can talk about it. We're streaming this, of course, on Facebook and on YouTube. The comments are just flooding in, as you can imagine, and a lot of them are focusing around the mental health question. And Michael, I'll come back to you on this. We heard from Connie Sanders, whose father died in Columbine.
Sorry, but I just...
What is it about the mental health piece of this that there aren't enough beds, there isn't a big enough conversation, and there isn't enough funding to deal with the mental health problem that goes hand in hand with this gun issue?
Well, let's be careful here. I mean, mental health is a major issue, but we have the same issue in Canada. They have the same issue in Europe. In this country, there's not enough money invested, not enough beds. Someone can be aware that they have mental health issues, and they can't find any treatment. It doesn't lead to massacres. So let's be careful. Also, it tends to I suppose, marginalize the mental health community and say you're a potential mass murderer. In fact, most people with mental health issues are victims rather than perpetrators. This young man bought a gun that was a lethal weapon. He bought smoke bombs. Why does anyone need that for self-defense? In the figure you mentioned earlier, and I've seen that figure too, and it may be accurate, we don't quite know. Some people think as many as 40% of Americans own guns. But we heard Trump say this today, and we've heard other people. Again, how can we digress from the real issue? The real issue is the American psychological obsession with gun ownership. It's not people who have mental health challenges. And many of the people who've committed these crimes have not struggled with mental health. Look, in the UK, Dunblane, 1996, I think, there were already very strong gun control laws, but this was a massacre of children in the United Kingdom, and immediately there was far stronger gun control legislation, and there was virtually no protest about that. If you propose that today in the United States, you know there will be a mass protest. You're taking away basic civil liberties of the American people.
Katie, I'm going to put a question to you that we're getting on the comment board from Chelsea Buddy, saying, with both sides of the gun control debate entrenched, how can the discussion shift to changing society's glorifications of guns as problem-solving tools to get back to more traditional hunting and target sports tools? The other one that sort of went part and parcel with that was a question around the NRA and just how powerful it is. Do you have a sense, I mean, you've written about this stuff before, do you have a sense of why and how the NRA carries such enormous sway over American politics?
It's interesting. It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that the NRA became seen as being very influential. That reputation sort of carried on. I don't know if the NRA actually has to do much lobbying, active lobbying anymore, simply because the very fact that it exists keeps politicians of both stripes, of all stripes really, in line, because there's always that fear at the back of their head, like, oh no, if I do this, then the NRA is going to come get me and I'm going to lose my seat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's interesting. I'm not even sure if we have an equivalent in Canada in terms of a lobby that's so powerful. It barely has to do anything other than exist, and it seems to be able to hold an enormous sway over the politics. But at the same time, I don't think we can sort of, it would be simplistic to suggest that it's all about sort of the political interest in the NRA and the advocacy in that world. If there was a critical mass of public support for gun control, I suspect that you would see politicians starting to move in that direction. And I think your guest earlier made it pretty clear that she doesn't see it either. I think that's the real question. When do you get that critical mass of public opinion really wanting to move towards something? Because at that point, I don't think even the NRA could hold it back.
Right. Paul, we've got you back. Let's let you weigh in.
Well, I think picking up on Katie's point, politics responds to those who organize and show up. And whether you hate them or love them, the NRA is a really clever organizing machine. And some research recently identifies that the NRA has about 5 million plus members. That's more members than a whole bunch of social justice cause organizations all put together, including things like the National Organization of Women and the groups that mobilize for in support of minority ethnic rights. And the question that might raise for some people is, well, does that mean Americans Americans care more about gun ownership as a cause than they do about women's equality or minority rights. And I don't think the answer to that is yes. The difference is how the NRA organizes. They don't first and foremost try and attract people to their organization simply by saying, hey, come join our cause and we're going to amplify your voice in the world of politics. Rather, they organize in a way that's designed to make a difference in the wallets of gun owners who want to practice their recreation and save a bit of money. So for instance, their $35 annual membership fee gets them really inexpensive insurance in case, wait for it, they're ever injured by a gunshot. Yeah. Plus they can get discounts on going to a gun shop and shooting ranges and safety courses, etc. And they get a cool magazine that they like reading. And so more people are joining the NRA because the NRA can make a functional difference to their wallets. And so that's attracting people to the group. And then once they have large numbers of people attracted to that group, they can start to mobilize a subset of them to be powerful voices when the time is right in the world of politics. The group that, the opposite side of the debate hasn't got that same kind of organization in place. They haven't been building up that membership. And so with the less formal mobilization of those who oppose gun or are in favor of gun control, by comparison with what the NRA can do, the world of politics says, hey, I'm going to typically lean towards those who are better organized because that's where I get my political cover.
It's funny, you make a lot of the same points we've made on the business show earlier in the day, and not specifically on this, but that the NRA is a reflection of money, which is a reflection of an industry, and the firearms and ammo industry in the United States makes $13.5 billion in annual revenue, $1.5 billion in profits. It employs 260,000 people. The other side deals from people donating money to try to do good. Michael Coren, is the balance of this debate actually, are we hearing from both sides when you factor in just how much money is at play?
Well, yes and no. For example, there are certain stations, CNN, for example, coverage last night, virtually every voice was condemning that they were incredulous. There hasn't been any control of gun ownership. But when it comes to money, Ted Cruz, what, $360,000 last year? I mean, they give millions of dollars, but it's not just about money. There are other organizations that do have money. It's also about political culture. Remember, virtually the entire Republican Party believes in gun ownership to varying degrees, but you couldn't be a successful Republican if you said, I don't believe in gun ownership. The Democrat Party is not, well, it's not divided, but it's not unanimous on this. There are many in the Democrat Party, not just in the South, all over the country, who still believe in gun ownership. If you look at European ownership of guns, I think it's Finland, Cyprus, and Switzerland where most guns are owned per head. That doesn't lead to mass shootings. It's not just legislation. Even if the NRA disappeared, there's something which is deeper, more profound in the culture of the United States. I'm not being anti-American here because I admire that country so much. But it's not just about legislation. To change legislation, well, what comes first, culture or legislation? I think until and unless the country changes, no president, however eager he is to do so, and I think Obama was, will be able to change the nation. And one more thing. As with de Gaulle withdrawing from North Africa and Nixon from Vietnam, I think it may well take a moderate Republican to actually deal with this issue rather than a Democrat. But that's going to be a long time in waiting.
Well, and Donald Trump previously has spoken about, he's previously spoken on the opposite side of almost every issue he talks about. But Katie, there are a few people I know that know the mechanics of introducing legislation than you. In the United States, where it is so polarized, is it even feasible to think that as stands, a group of people like that could come to some kind of an agreement to introduce some kind of a change to affect? I mean, this kid who carried this out was legally barred from buying, he wasn't old enough to buy a handgun, but he could buy an AR-15.
Yeah, I think it also gets complicated because there are states involved and there are different jurisdictions, and there isn't necessarily sort of a consistent approach across the country. At the same time, I have to say, and I'm pretty tied up with Canadian politics, so I don't get a whole heck of a lot of time to watch what's going on in the U.S.
Fair enough.
But it doesn't strike me that their Congress is too good at putting together bipartisan deals on complex public policy issues at the moment. So I'm not sure if this is precisely the time is right for that. But I mean, who knows? Again, I really think it comes down to when you've got a critical mass of people demanding it to the point where politicians are no longer able to kind of ignore it, wave it away, or say like, oh, there are two sides to the debate, I'm not going to take either of them. At a certain point, that will happen or won't happen, but that is, I think, what it would take for really transformative change.
Paul, if you could find hope in anything from this, is it that, you know, we see continued outrage, we see people speaking honestly and passionately and trying to change the conversation?
Potentially, but the population health scholar in me anticipates that we will see relatively soon another similar kind of accident, which after the fact we said could have been prevented by the evidence that calls on, you know, reasonable gun control. But that's the rub of it. The problem with this issue is that it occurs at the intersection of two values, both of which on their own are good. On the one hand, we want to, you know, care for people who are vulnerable, protect people from harm, and that's something that people can nod their heads to. And so that's sort of the value that comes up after a shooting. But the moment the gun control conversation comes into it, it then intersects with another deeply held value about liberty or freedom from oppression, which is either like freedom from the state or freedom from someone who might want to hurt me, like in a self-preservation kind of way. And those two values then are jarring. And people's reactions to gun control debates are about those values, and evidence can't really get its way in there to push people to agree with the evidence, because at the end of the day, it's not about the evidence, it's about how they rank those two values. And so it takes a broader cultural conversation to try and, over time, have people reorder those two values in their mind in relation to the issue of gun control. But that's not happening right now, because the one group trying to mold the conversation about gun control is actually pushing for the exact opposite view.
Listen, you guys, powerful conversation. I'm really glad we did this, and I'm glad to get all of your perspectives on this. Paul Kershaw, Michael Coren, Katie O'Malley, thanks to you all.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers.